She is alive. The small voice cut through the canopy of umbrellas like a clean blade. It landed in the plaza and changed the temperature of the crowd, making cameras tilt, making a billionaire I had photographed a dozen times stand as if someone had taken the air from the room. Rain came down in a fine curtain, pooling on bronze letters and dulling the black leather of a jacket. The witness was smaller than the press expected, a girl with knobby knees and a hoodie 2 sizes too large, dark hair pulled into a messy knot, sneakers caked in mud. Her hand shook when she unfolded a scrap of cloth and showed, as if to prove she was not inventing anything, a faded necklace with a tiny brass pendant engraved with 2 letters only someone close would know. A few people laughed, a few cursed softly, a few reporters clicked faster. But the man at the front pressed his palm to his temple like he was trying to hold in a remembered wound. Someone in a suit said this was impossible. A woman from the Billionaire's team mouthed denials. But the girl added a detail that did not belong to rumor. A thin, white scar along the collarbone, shaped like a crescent, originally hidden by a childhood tattoo. That scar was not in any missing person report. The pause in the crowd felt like a ledger closing. If this was true, we had a lead. If this was false, we would still be chasing a phantom. The promise in the air was blunt and unambiguous. We would follow that scrap of cloth and that pendant, and no one would be allowed to change the conversation. If this moved you at all, press like and tell us where you are watching from. The pendant caught the light and flashed like a small accusation. Ava Reed had been out of sleep for 2 days. She smelled of coffee and rain and paper. She had a private investigator's license and the patience of someone who had learned that patience looked a lot like brutality on paper. At the memorial, she met Zoe Carter, 12 years old, small and furious in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with needing to be believed. Their first exchanges were sharp and oddly maternal. 10 sentences each, like checks in a ledger. "Where did you see her?" Ava asked. "By the old loading dock," Zoe answered. "There was a van with no plates and a man with a white glove." "Can you show me?" "I can lead you." "Do you remember the time?" "Just after the fog lifted, before the dawn buses." "Was anyone with you?" "Just a man and a dog that didn't bark." "What did he smell like?" "Oil and peppermint." "Are you sure?" "I am sure." The crowd around them hummed. A press assistant tried to pull Ava away, but she did not move. A lawyer from Hale Enterprises hovered like a shadow and smiled like a threat. The museum lights reflected in a lens and threw a thin beam across the pendant. Zoe's evidence was small and intimate, and yet it had the shape of an accusation against a man whose wealth could buy silence. Ava's hand steadied. She had a reputation for taking the small, lonely threads people tossed aside and turning them into ropes. She put her card in Zoe's small, clammy hand and said we would start at the loading dock. Ava's backstory was in her hands, and the way she did not let anybody tell her that something could not be true. She grew up in a neighborhood where promises were currency and trust was rationed. As a child, she learned how to read rooms the way other children learn to read books. Her father was a mechanic and taught her how to listen to engines, to know when a cough meant a bearing was failing and when the pitch of a door slam meant someone left for good. She studied journalism because she wanted to make a living out of facts, and then discovered that facts were expensive when you tried to publish them. Years of unpaid reporting, a layoff that smelled of a corporate house cleaning, then a private investigator's license earned on a kitchen table with a lamp and tenacity. She lost a sister to an unsolved case and kept a picture folded in a wallet as a private oath. Ava's training in surveillance and evidence chain protocols came from nights spent tailing corrupt contractors for community groups and from a short stint working with a forensic accountant who believed in receipts as scripture. That loss was the engine that moved her current obsession. She could not pretend that the billionaire's name meant nothing. She knew the smell of fear and the smell of money. The scar on her chest from a childhood surgery sat like a secret under her blouse and reminded her that pain often leaves a map. She carried a small notebook,
3 little knives for opening sealed envelopes, and the belief that a young witness with a pendant could be the fulcrum of something enormous. Zoe Carter's backstory was shorter in syllables but long in the way it bent people toward tenderness. Born in a shelter on a humid August night, she had been moved from foster home to foster home until the age of 8, when a school counselor noticed how she noticed things. Zoe learned to watch without being watched. She had a habit of collecting small objects from abandoned lots: buttons, a chipped teacup handle, a scrap of a map. When Zoe was 10, she had been hospitalized for a week after a car rolled onto a curb. The scar on her collarbone came from a medical intervention she could not explain to officials at the time. It had become a sign to her that bodies keep records, and if you learned to them, you could find stories others overlooked. She loved drawing and could sketch the face of a stranger after 5 seconds. When her mother disappeared a year ago, the police listed it as a runaway case, as if absence could be paperwork. Zoe kept everything her mother left behind, including a tiny brass pendant passed down from a grandmother, and a hand-sewn scarf with initials too small for anyone to read. She had seen the van by the docks because she had been scavenging for copper and had followed a dog that went the same way. She was wary of grown-ups, but she trusted Ava in the way small people sometimes trust strangers who offer street eyes. Zoe's ability to notice and her necklace and scarf would become the pivot of a case that would force lawyers to reveal emails, would demand forensic protocols be rechecked, and would expose a surveillance net that stretched from seaside warehouses to boardroom servers. The first major scene of investigation was the loading dock by the harbor, a stretch of cold concrete and iron where gulls waited like an audience. It smelled of fish, diesel, wet rope, and old salt. The air felt heavy and metallic. Ava and Zoe arrived at dawn with 2 companions she had recruited for reasons both practical and emotional. Marcus Lee was an ex-Navy petty officer who could handcuff a lie and calibrate a camera with equal patience. Hannah Ortiz was a local reporter who liked to collect documents and had a taste for subpoenas. Theo Park was a reluctant hacker Ava had convinced with a story about receipts and conscience. There were 6 senses at work: the grit of salt under fingernails, the smell of fish scales, the sound of a far horn, the slick of oil on wooden beams, a taste of coffee gone cold, and the blue chill of the morning on exposed skin. Their dialogue was granular and procedural, and it ran in the rhythm of practice teams. "We split up," Ava said. "Marcus and I checked the dockside warehouses. Hannah, talk to the morning shift. Theo, can you run a plate trace on any unmarked vans in the area?" "I will check CCTV feeds," Theo answered. "Expect firewall obfuscations," Marcus said. "There will be dogs on the premises," Hannah said. "There was a van with no plates," Zoe insisted. "Describe it again," Ava asked. "Plain white, no logos, a dent on the rear left, a missing hubcap, a thin scuff of green paint near the bumper." "White vans are a cliché," Marcus said. "Clichés are where the guilty hide," Ava answered. "Any witnesses?" Hannah asked. "A dockhand who smokes by the chain link," Zoe said. "His name?" "Jerry." "Find Jerry," Marcus said. "I will check manifests," Ava added. The scene had the tactile detail of rust on a boat, the visual of a torn poster clinging to a pole, the auditory sting of boots on grating, the olfactory bite of engine. Oil, the cold that numbed fingers, and the faint sweetness of a bakery truck rounding the corner. The first physical evidence they found was a scrap of fabric caught on a loading cleat, fibers that matched Zoe's scarf. The lab samples would later show traces of a unique dye used by a textile supplier under contract to a shell company with ties to Hale Enterprises. The initial protocol was simple: photograph, bag, label, chain of custody. The team executed the basics in the way people do who have been taught that procedures protect truth. They logged the scene with doc notes and a camera's timestamp that would later be crucial to corroborate Zoe's timeline. The first rescue was partial and messy. They followed a lead to an industrial storage facility 2 hours away, a place that smelled of cardboard and something chemical and hummed with refrigeration units. Inside, the air was cold and full of static. Lights buzzed, shadows moved like low tides. A man with a white glove did not appear immediately. They found a small room with bunk beds in a single, nearly empty duffel bag. The girl inside was not the missing woman everyone expected, but a young adult with eyes that looked like they had been through a storm. The exchange there was quick and loaded. "Who are you?" Ava asked. "I am Maya," the woman whispered. "Did you meet a man in a van?" Marcus asked. "Yes. He said come with him. He said he could make money disappear." "Do you have a name or mark?" Theo asked. "He called himself Mr. Hale in the beginning, but later used a different name. He wears a ring with a small black stone." "Did he hurt you?" Hannah asked. "Not like knives," Maya said. "He broke other things." There were 12 conversational turns in rapid succession, each one like a key turned in a lock. Maya had a scar along the lower jaw hidden by a scarf, and a bracelet with a symbol that matched an emblem seen in corporate memos later. She had been moved among storage units used as temporary housing for people meant to be invisible. The sensory details were strong. The metallic taste in their mouths from the cold air. The damp canvas of the duffel bag rubbing against a palm. The sticky residue on a pallet that matched an adhesive used in a shipment. The light dent of a fluorescent bulb humming. And the muffled shouts of a forklift outside. The rescue was partial because Maya needed medical attention and therapy, and because the woman everyone had come for was not there. They took Maya to a clinic run by an NGO partner, and the forensic team began standard intake procedures. The process was written with industry terms and human tenderness. A nurse wrote notes in a doc labeled evidence intake. Blood samples were taken with consent and cataloged in sterile vials. DNA swabs were stored in numbered envelopes, and photographs of
Maya's scars were taken with neutral background and scale. The protocol was precise and would later be cited in court as exemplifying chain of custody ethos. Evidence began to open a door into the corporate underworld. Theo worked through servers that hummed like sleeping insects. He pulled up logs, found dated access codes linked to a vendor account, and traced IP obfuscations through a chain of proxies. The narrative of their digital revelation unfolded with the dry clarity of a tech doc and the charged emotion of a human being finding their name in a ledger. "This vendor is registered to a shell in Bermuda," Theo said. "There are payment runs labeled benevolent housing, but they match warehouse leases." "There is an internal memo with a symbol," Hannah said, reading aloud a paragraph that mentioned a containment protocol and linked it to a name that echoed the pendant's letters. "The emails use encrypted attachments that open with the passphrase that looks like someone combining a name and a pet's nickname," Ava said. "We need a warrant, and we will need a judge who understands obfuscation," Marcus added. The procedure Theo described in 300 characters was clinical and precise. He outlined how he would create a read-only image of the suspect's server, hash it to preserve integrity, and then extract metadata and file headers to reconstruct deleted attestations. The description of the forensics was compact but intelligible. A disk image, a cryptographic hash, an audit trail, and the need for chain of custody to be printed and notarized. They found a transmission log that showed a file labeled portfolio.ppt sent to a private address at 02:13 a.m. on a night that matched Zoe's timeline. When the file was opened, it revealed internal slides showing logistical diagrams, port assignments, and a spreadsheet with names and little checkboxes that read processed next to rows that matched missing persons. It smelled like collusion. At roughly 1/3 into the timeline, they paused to talk to you. The camera on the table recorded faces that had become close to raw. We asked for a moment. We wanted to know if you felt the same cold knot tightening in your chest. If you had been in Ava's place, what would you do first? Type "go to the harbor" or "call the police." Your voice matters because investigations like this one depend on pressure and community attention. Comment below with the choice you would make and where you are watching from. Your replies help validate small witnesses, and sometimes they provide a key detail we did not catch.
The room smelled of stale coffee and resolve. Zoe chewed on the hem of her hoodie and watched the screen when people wrote to say they were following along. It was a small moment that reminded everyone involved that public scrutiny could be an ally against well-resourced silence. The exposure sequence escalated. Ava arranged a controlled leak to a journalist she trusted.
Hannah wrote a careful piece that folded the lab reports, the server transmissions, the pendant detail, and the interviews into a narrative that avoided conjecture and stuck to provable fact. The Billionaire's PR team pushed a counter-narrative about misidentification and opportunism. There were tense exchanges between lawyers that read like chess. "Cease and desist," a terse email demanded. "You are publishing unverified claims," another said. But by then, the team had corroboration. The textile dye matched a shipment logged in an invoice that bore a Hale subsidiary's watermark. The log files had been preserved and hash verified. They filed for emergency hearings. In the courtroom, the language was careful and fierce. A judge ordered temporary restraints on certain accounts associated with shipments flagged as suspicious. The public reaction was polarized. On the one hand, there were rallies outside the Billionaire's properties with protest signs, candles placed at the memorial, flower beds strewn with notes. On the other hand, social media accounts poured out defenses, questionings of Zoe's credibility, and attempts to discredit Ava as an activist with an agenda. The trial atmosphere smelled of paper and coffee and the peculiar ozone of fluorescent court lights. Zoe testified under cross-examination with the steady sincerity of someone who had nothing to gain by lying. Her voice did not tremble when she pointed to her pendant and described the scar on the missing woman's collarbone in detail. The courtroom had 12 exchanges between attorneys and witnesses that read like a controlled battle of facts. In the public square, the transmission of video clips and documents was relentless. A live broadcast captured a moment in which a slip of an internal email used the phrase containment protocol and a small emblem that matched the pendant. The Billionaire's supporters called for restraint. His detractors called for prosecution. The evidence was piling in a way that made obfuscation more expensive. Retaliation came in a wave that made them move from legal strategy to personal defense. Men in suits showed up at the clinic and asked for patient lists. A car followed Ava home one night until Marcus confronted it with a flashlight and a camera. Someone tampered with Theo's apartment Wi-Fi router and tried to erase logs. Ava's phone was pinged by an unknown tracker. They felt eyes on them, and not only metaphorically. The scene for the infiltration mission overseas smelled different and colder. They had traced a holding company to a holding company abroad with a reputation for lax oversight. The team flew overnight. The air in that foreign city was warm, citrus on the breeze, but the warehouse district smelled of grease and old paint and the metallic tang of diesel. They planned an infiltration with the precision of people who knew how to minimize noise while maximizing outcome. Marcus and Ava would go inside and recon. Theo would provide a digital safe line and a decoy transmission. Hannah would be the external anchor for media if the extraction became public. On "My mark," Ava said. "We go in 2-minute windows," Marcus replied. "My feed will loop for 2 minutes," Theo said. "If you see lights, abort," Hannah warned. "We have to get evidence and a person if possible," Ava said. "We go in quiet," Marcus repeated. "Zoe stays with the safe house," Ava confirmed. "No heroics," Theo said. There were 11 exchanges full of tension and technical detail. The team moved like shadows, the scrape of boots on concrete, the smell of oil and grease, the press of the night air, the taste of breath held, and then finally a small sound like a lid being slid aside. Inside, they found files, hard drives stored in a plastic crate under a pallet, and a small room with a bed and a locked trunk. When they opened the trunk, they found clothing, IDs, and a photograph of the missing woman with a child that matched Zoe's description. A camera feed they had not expected flashed a small live stream timestamped to the previous week.
The live feed had been interrupted during an argument and captured a name that made Ava's blood run cold. The operation had almost succeeded when alarms startled them. They scrambled, took what they could, and left with the hum of distant engines chasing them. A scuffle on a stair led to a sprained ankle and a torn sleeve. They escaped, but not unscathed. The team had executed infiltration with enough evidence to cement a public case, but had become a bigger target for a defendant with resources. The climax was public and messy. A live hearing was scheduled and the world watched. The billionaire arrived with counsel, an army of PR, and a face practiced to be untroubled. Ava sat with her team and Zoe in the front row, the pendant visible under a sweater. The courtroom filled with a hum of cameras, the smell of cologne, the scraping of chairs, and the discreet whisper of court administrators. The lead prosecutor presented a timeline that began with Zoe's scrap of cloth and threaded through harbor evidence, storage unit rescue, server logs, invoices, and the live stream. They played the transmission that cut the billionaire's composure like glass. The exchanges in the courtroom were sharp, controlled, and unrelenting. Counsel for Hale attempted to frame the operation as a private act's misinterpretation. "There is no direct link," he argued. "We demand concrete evidence that my client ordered or financed any of these activities." "The invoices bear signatures authorized by your client," the prosecutor responded. "The server logs show IP access from an executive terminal associated with your client's accounts." "Those are circumstantial," the defense said. "Circumstantial evidence can still form a conviction," the prosecutor shot back. The tension rose as witnesses came forward. Maya testified about a ring with a black stone worn by a man who used multiple names. Jerry the dockhand described a white van with a dent and a chipped hubcap. Theo testified about the hash codes and the read-only images he had created. There were more than 12 exchanges in the final cross-examination alone, each one a razor. When Zoe took the stand, her small voice described the pendant and the scar with an authority that made even skeptical reporters lean forward. The billionaire watched with a face like a statue. But the tipping point was a simple thing. A former procurement officer turned whistleblower provided an internal spreadsheet with a column labeled dispositions and checkboxes that matched names of people who had been listed as missing. It bore the emblem Zoe recognized on the pendant. The judge called a recess, then asked for further discovery. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, chanting. Inside, the billionaire's lawyers realized the trial had become less about plausible deniability and more about paper and receipts and the tangible network of evidence. In the most charged moment, the billionaire spoke. His testimony was measured. He denied knowing specifics, but admitted to having authorized contracts for housing and logistical support that he had thought were philanthropic. The room found a new idea in the admission. The billionaire's empire had been presented as a philanthropic facade, and there was a cost. There were at least 3 moments of internal crisis that shaped the team's choices, and each lasted with a compact intensity. The first moment came when Ava considered whether to publish an unredacted file that could expose persons at risk. She sat at her desk with a single lamp and thought about the faces of people she had promised to protect. The decision tore at her because transparency would mean danger for some, and it would mean justice for others. The second moment was Zoe at night having nightmares about being taken, waking with the taste of diesel in her mouth, asking aloud if her mother was alive. The group's reaction was personal and immediate. Marcus sat by the bed and hummed a cadence he had used on watch in a storm to keep people breathing. The third moment came when Theo's apartment was compromised, and he found evidence of an attempted deletion of logs he had spent days securing. He swore, a small sharp sound, and then redoubled his efforts to back up data to 3 separate encrypted containers. Each of those moments ran 2 paragraphs and left the team changed. They were each about 550 characters and pushed the narrative toward a moral decision point. Those moments crystallized the stakes in ways that made the final actions inevitable. Procedures and technical descriptions appeared with exacting brevity when needed. The forensic protocol for validating the textile fibers was as follows. Collect fabric samples using nitrile gloves, place each sample in sterile paper bags labeled with time and location, send to an accredited lab, perform dye analysis through high-performance liquid chromatography, match dye signatures against vendor databases, and preserve residue swatches for chain of custody. The digital procedure for server imaging required a forensic
workstation to create a bit-by-bit image of the drive, compute an MD5 and SHA-256 hash to validate integrity, document the imaging process with timestamps, and store the image in a verified vault accessible only to authorized personnel. The legal process for securing emergency discovery involved drafting ex parte motions with exhibits attached, securing a judge's temporary order to preserve evidence, and serving a subpoena on third-party vendors while maintaining privilege protections for sensitive informant details. Each procedure was described in clear language and filed into the record as part of the growing evidence. The aftermath was a slow and public unspooling. The billionaire faced regulatory scrutiny, civil suits, and a chorus of public condemnation that a single man with vast resources could not silence. His empire restructured divisions that allowed the events to happen, and board members resigned like dominoes. Non-profit partners severed ties after the documents formed a pattern no PR campaign could fix. Lawsuits followed. The legal drama filled cable cycles and online conversations. For the team, the cost was real. Marcus carried the memory of a night raid in which he thought he might not return. He had a limp from an old injury that pulsed with new strain. Theo moved his server farm to neutral jurisdictions and considered leaving the city. Hannah received threats and kept a personal protection detail for months. Zoe, who had been the pivot of this revelation, survived but not unscarred. There were victories and losses. 1 month later, the first epilogue moment showed immediate consequences. The court had issued interim orders freezing certain offshore accounts and referring the matter to a federal investigative body. The community organized around a new registry for vulnerable missing persons, and a small fund was set up to support witnesses like Zoe. Ava used the fund to pay for therapy for those rescued and to hire a paralegal to manage an overload of tips. Media outlets ran follow-up stories highlighting systemic failures at port authorities and at subcontractors who had been nominally responsible for housing logistics. The smell of change was small but persistent. The pendant had become a symbol on protest signs and on the collar pins of investigative journalists. People filed complaints with oversight boards, and several lower-level employees at implicated companies were put on administrative leave pending inquiry. 3 months after the verdict in the public court of opinion, the second epilogue snapshot revealed larger shifts. The federal agency launched a task force on corporate facilitated disappearance and introduced a protocol for supply chain transparency at ports. Legislators proposed bills to tighten oversight of philanthropic contracting and to make contractor records public for humanitarian projects. The Billionaire's company announced an internal audit and pledged cooperation with investigators while quietly facing class action claims. Zoe began school again and attended therapy, learning to talk about her mother with a counselor who specialized in reunification trauma. Maya became an advocate for people who had been trafficked in industrial storage facilities. Systems and spoke at community centers about the need for safe housing options. Theo testified in a hearing about digital obfuscation and helped draft technical guidelines for evidence preservation. Ava gave a few interviews and used the visibility to promote the registry. The social climate shifted toward a more skeptical view of anonymous philanthropy and an awareness that evidence often hides in small objects like pendants and in small witnesses like children. 6 months later, the final epilogue moment painted a longer arc. There was an ongoing civil litigation and a criminal referral that moved slowly through the system. The billionaire settled several claims but maintained his innocence publicly. He made concessions that included establishing an independent oversight committee and funding community programs, but he did not admit criminal culpability. The registry had been expanded nationally, and several cold cases connected to similar logistical patterns were reopened. Zoe and Ava maintained a cautious friendship.
Zoe had started a small art program for kids from shelters. Ava opened a small office with a sign that read Private Investigator and Advocate. Marcus worked as a security consultant for nonprofits and visited the docks sometimes to smoke a cigarette and remember the nights when the harbor felt like a battlefield. Theo co-authored a white paper on digital evidence that became a reference for investigators. Hannah won an award for investigative reporting and used the prize money to finance a fellowship for reporters doing long-form investigations into corporate malpractice. The material changes did not undo the harm inflicted, nor did they erase the nights Zoe lay awake replaying the van's engine in her head. But they shifted the balance toward accountability. Public discourse had moved a degree closer to insisting that witnesses be protected and documents be transparent. The epilogue ended with an image of a small pendant shining in morning light on Zoe's collarbone and a final rhetorical turn. The truth had arrived not as a thunderbolt, but as a chain of small, stubborn details an unlikely witness could hold and a team that would not let them be ignored. In the end, they had brought back fragments of a life, they had exposed a pattern that implicated power and money, and they had paid a price that included sleepless nights, bruised bodies, and damaged trust. The public had watched, argued, and then acted in small and concrete ways. The memorial that had first hosted Zoe's claim now had a small plaque listing resources for kin of missing persons, and a flower bed planted each year in memory of those still unlocated. The case had ripples that forced audits and conversations and modest policy changes. When asked what justice looked like, Ava said it was a slow accumulation of truth and protections for witnesses. Zoe said it was being believed. If you want to keep following cases like this, subscribe and be part of a community that listens to small witnesses and holds power to account. The pendant still catches the morning light.
Light, and the scar still tells a story. Truth arrives wearing ordinary things, and it asks that we pay attention.